Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to Council-led Housing Forum. Council-led Housing Forum is hosted by Future of London. If you're not familiar with us, we're a network. We do networking and knowledge and leadership programs. And today in Council-led Housing Forum, we're looking at the topic of building safety. Now, the Council-led Housing Forum is supported by the GLA, by BPTW, by Potter Raper, and also by Red Loft. My name is Viska Sri Chandrasekhara, and I'm the Council-led Housing Forum Manager for Future of London. So we've got quite a packed agenda. I mean, we're being quite ambitious. Our first presentation is particularly ambitious, looking at the legal overview in just 15 minutes. We're then moving on to talk about what does this mean in practice, and really what can you be doing now, given the importance and the lead-in time for many of the things that are changing around building safety. We've got some Q&A time. We will have a short break, and then we also have a presentation around how you use BIM and the golden thread and how that will work in practice. And we're delighted to have that included. So do come back after the short break very promptly. It's Q&A after that, it's contributions, and we get to do some small group discussion as well. So we're really going to be able to get, I hope, into some very practical discussion around how we are preparing for this huge challenge. So I don't want to take any more time up. I want to introduce you to Mark London. He's a partner in Devonshire's. We're really pleased, Mark, that you've joined us this morning. You're one of the experts and a lead in this, providing a lot of advice, I believe, to your clients around preparing. So I think the best thing is for me to basically bring you straight in on your first slide. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Visaka. And yes, I am challenged this morning to talk to you about two very significant pieces of legislation in 50 minutes. So I will get cracking straight away. So the two pieces of legislation we're going to talk about, first of all, is the Fire Safety Act 2021. Now, the Fire Safety Act has already received royal assent, but it has not yet been the subject of a commencement order, which means that it's not yet on the statute books, as it were. That is not likely to happen until later this year, when we are expecting to see some published guidance about how one carries out risk assessment, external wall system structure, etc. So that is going to become law this year, and you will have to start complying with it from this year. The Building Safety Bill, the latest iteration of which was published only a few weeks ago, is adopting a far more staggered approach, and that's because it is a very ambitious piece of draft legislation. So we've already had Gateway 1, which is going to be introduced through the Town and Country Planning Act, which is coming into force in August 2021, so this year. The government have also announced that within 2 months of receiving royal assent, we're going to see the bill introduce changes to the Defective Premises Act, and we're going to see the reignition, or the ignition rather, of Section 38 of the Building Act, which is going to give people the ability to pursue developers for breach of a statutory duty owed pursuant to the building regulations. So very significant developments, both of those. So the timeframes for implementation are the Fire Safety Act later this year, and the Building Safety Bill, which will be a very staggered approach over the course of the next couple of years. So if I could have the next slide, please, Visaka. Well, let's talk about the Fire Safety Act now, because the Fire Safety Act has already received royal assent and is not going to be changed. It is what it is. It is a very important piece of legislation, and to a certain extent has flown under the radar. Those of you who were following it will have noted the spats in the House of Commons and the House of Lords over proposed amendments to avoid leaseholders having to pick up the cost of any remedial work to buildings. But the scope and ambition of the Fire Safety Act is really quite significant. The idea is that this is going to force people who own buildings with 2 or more residential premises in them to carry out a fire risk assessment of the external wall system, along with the overall structure, any common parts, and as I say in the slide, the doors and windows includes, the external walls includes doors and windows in those walls and anything attached to the exterior of those walls. So picking up the same sort of language that we saw in the building regulations amendments in 2018. The upshot of all of this is that from now on, if you own a building that contains 2 or more residential premises, your suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment is going to have to include an assessment of the external wall system. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay. Now, everyone who's familiar with the regulatory reform order will know the language of Article 9. The fire risk assessment must be suitable and sufficient. Assessment of the risks to which relevant persons are exposed for the purpose of identifying general fire precautions. Those are the things that you have to put in place in order to mitigate or alleviate or reduce or expunge the risk in your building. And general fire precautions, of course, are undertaken with the overarching obligation to and aim is to ensure that the premises is safe. So the question then becomes, well, how does one go about assessing safety, for example, of an external wall system? And we have draft PAS 9980, which is out for consultation at the moment, and that is, to give it its long title, a fire risk appraisal and assessment of external wall construction and cladding of existing blocks and flats. It's a code of practice. What PAS 9980 is designed to do is to give fire engineers and fire risk assessors a methodology whereby they can determine through observation and through understanding the makeup of the external wall whether the risk to persons within the building is low, moderate, or high, and the risk assessment is made accordingly. Now, there is a little bit of controversy about whether or not this has to be done by a fire engineer. The idea is that it doesn't need to be, but in circumstances where complexities arise during the course of the fire risk assessment, the idea is that a fire risk assessor may well be required. Now, that brings, of course, a whole separate discussion about resource to do all of this sort of stuff, but there we are. Now, the idea of PAS 9980 is it is not a way of measuring whether or not your building complies with the functional requirements of the building regulations. It is emphatically not a building regulations test. It is a holistic assessment of risk. It is not a methodology for determining whether or not a contractor has breached its contractual obligations, particularly where those contractual obligations include an obligation to comply with the functional requirements of the building regulations. What it is a system where if both parties choose to do so, i.e. the risk assessor and the building owner, they can adopt PAS 9980. One other method of assessing safety, of course, in the external system of the building is to apply the functional requirements of the building regulations, in particular B4, which is about the spread of fire across the surface of the building, having regard to its height and location, and B3, which is all about cavity barriers, reducing or inhibiting the spread of smoke and fire within unseen cavities. So there is no prescribed methodology. The Fire Safety Act itself does anticipate in due course that there will be statutory guidance that will have to be followed, and whether that becomes a version of PAS 9980 or something entirely different remains to be seen. So that's where we are with the Fire Safety Act. So if I could have the next slide, please, Fasaka. So timeframes, well, as I've said at the outset, it's going to become law this year. You're going to have to carry out your fire risk assessment, probably review it annually, as you no doubt do at the moment, but it's really a question of identifying where you're going to start, because no one is going to be able to click their fingers and have descend into their organization hundreds of qualified fire risk assessors. Now, particularly for local authorities as well as RPs who can own between them many thousands of buildings with 2 or more residential properties in them, the task is a slightly overwhelming one. Now, a lot of these buildings can be discounted, or the risk assessment can be carried out relatively easily if it's twin blocks of masonry, for example, if it's a 1930s building made of brick. Modern buildings, however, may require more. So where do you start? Well, it may be perfectly rational for you to take the view that you're going to look at your timber frame buildings first of all. We've had lots of problems with timber frame buildings, and some of the most significant fires post-Grenfell have been in relatively low-rise timber frame blocks. So you may take the rational view that that's where you're going to start your risk assessment. But we do have a problem with resources. We only have a couple of hundred fire engineers in the country, and we only have a couple of hundred fire risk assessors who are qualified to do this sort of stuff. So the idea is that the MHCLG, in conjunction with the Building Safety Regulator and RICS, are going to try and upskill surveyors and other construction professionals to enable them to carry out these risk assessments. Whether that is going to be successful or not remains to be seen. There is then the question of cost. Now, it is entirely probable that when you go to carry out your external wall risk assessments, you're going to find precisely the same sort of problems that we find in taller buildings in particular. So there may well be combustible insulation, not unlawful, of course, in a building below 80 metres, but that may well be sitting alongside an external wall system that contains defective or missing cavity barriers around windows, fire stop penetrations, things of that nature. And when those are considered alongside perhaps defects in compartmentation in the internal parts of the building, then you may well have a problem that needs to be remediated by paying a remedial contractor lots of money to fix it. The question then is who pays? Well, if you're within time to bring a claim against your contractor, you may well wish to do that, but it may well come down to leaseholders as well through their service charge. And despite the valiant attempts by Lords and MPs to introduce amendments to the Act that prohibited building owners from being able to seek to recover the costs of remediation from leaseholders, that was struck out. So it is still going to be open to building owners to look to recover those costs through the service charge. So that's the Fire Safety Act. Let's now move on to the Building Safety Bill. Now, normally when I talk about this, it takes me half a day or indeed an entire day. So I'm going to have to do it in 7.5 minutes. So in a nutshell, what does it do? Well, it creates a regime for higher risk buildings, which are going to be regulated by the Building Safety Regulator during both the construction and occupation phase. So from the minute you start thinking about building a high risk building to the moment you start thinking about demolishing it. And of course, a high risk building, for present purposes, is a building over 18 metres in height or more than 7 stories. Now that definition may change insofar as the Building Safety Regulator or the Secretary of State identify or see that there is a need to reduce the height. And we all know, of course, that tall buildings in Scotland are 11 metres and above. Then the Secretary of State has the power to do that. So the definition of a higher risk building is not set in stone. And the idea is that the regulation it covers both, as I say, the construction and the occupation phase. It creates a new building control regime. The local authority building control is going to be far more forensic, far more difficult for building control officers. We're still going to have a version of the old approved inspectors, and so they will still be with us, subject to, of course, being able to get public indemnity, professional indemnity insurance. But the whole idea is that it's going to become a lot more professional. It's going to be guided by codes of professional conduct. Individual building control officers will be subject to sanction if they get things wrong. So it really is ramping it up into a far more professional and far more detailed element of building control rather than the system that we have at the moment, which I think works very well in some cases and not too well in others. It's going to provide the Building Safety Regulator with an astonishing smorgasbord of powers to regulate and enforce the Building Safety Bill. Now, the Building Safety Regulator, as you probably all know, is part of the Health and Safety Executive. So the Building Safety Regulator will have the powers of the Health and Safety at Work Act, the powers of the Building Act as amended by the Building Safety Bill, which introduced more enforcement powers, and the whole panoply of enforcement powers that are contained within the Building Safety Bill themselves. So anything that you do wrong during the construction phase or the occupation phase, whether you're the client, the principal contractor or the principal designer, or during the occupation phase as the accountable person or the principal accountable person or the building safety manager, there is a means by which to smack you. It seems to me that this is one of the more interesting pieces of legislation I've seen in a long time, because it really does contain every single possible option for the building safety regulator. And of course, importantly, the other thing it does is it gives residents of higher risk buildings a voice in the management of those buildings, which is something that Dame Judith Hackett was very keen to ensure. So now we have to have a resident engagement plan, and we have to actively engage with residents, and we're going to have to provide them with information about their buildings, such as fire risk assessments and perhaps other documents as well. So if I could have the next slide, please. So let's look very quickly at the construction phase. There are going to be three gateways. Gateway 1, as I mentioned earlier, is coming into force in August of this year. That is the planning permission stage, where you have to submit a fire safety statement, and that fire safety statement will then have to be approved by the building safety regulator. You then move on to gateway 2 on the assumption it is so approved, and this is the gateway that you have to pass through in order to be able to actually put a spade in the ground and construct your high risk building. And you're going to have to supply detailed plans to the building safety regulator showing how the building will comply with building regulations, structural safety requirements, etc. Now, I know others are going to talk about the need to use BIM and the golden thread. And let me just say this: if you are not intending to use BIM, but you are intending to construct a high risk building, then you are going to be in serious trouble. It seems to me that it is going to be virtually impossible to comply with the golden thread requirements and the transporting of information throughout the lifetime of the building without having a concrete BIM model right at the very beginning. Gateway 3, the occupation phase. You get to practical completion, but of course practical completion is now no longer the test of whether you can actually put people in the building and occupy it. You're going to have to get your license to occupy from the building safety regulator, and in order to do that, you're going to have to submit your golden thread of information in the form of a building safety case. And your principal designer and your principal contractor are both going to have to declare that the building meets the requirements of the building regulations. Now, this is a hard stop again. You cannot occupy the building unless and until you get your building occupation certificate. So the gateways are a hard stop. Gateway 3 will provide the basis for the golden thread of information throughout the lifetime of the building. In fact, you start putting that together in Gateway 1. You pretty much have your designed building ready to go in Gateway 2, and Gateway 3 is your complete record of what has been constructed. We have new duty holders, of course. Confusingly, they are the same duty holders that currently exist in the CDM regulations. We have the client, we have the principal designer, principal contractor, contractor, and designer. Now, where it differs from the current CDM, the duties in the CDM regulations, which is all about site-based health and safety, the primary overriding obligation of the duty holders under the Building Safety Bill, and as will be put in the CDM regulations, is to make sure the high-risk building is built in accordance with building regulations. That is the fundamental objective and overriding purpose, which is very different from the current duties of principal designer or principal contractor that exist now in the CDM regulations. Can I have the next slide, please? Right, well, let's talk about very, very quickly, I've got a couple of minutes left, the accountable person and the principal accountable person. They are the people with whom the buck stops. Now, the principal accountable person is a new introduction to the Building Safety Bill, which was made in its most recent iteration to deal with the fact that you could quite possibly have more than one accountable person in a high-risk building. And the bill contains a mechanism for determining who is the principal accountable person in the event there is a dispute. And so for lawyers, it's going to be fantastic trying to work out who is the principal accountable person. But the principal accountable person is the person who has the majority of the obligations during the occupation phase. Don't fall for the point that the building safety manager is the person that has the overriding obligation. That is not the position. The accountable person is the person who has to identify and manage fire safety and structural risks within the high risk building. It is the building safety manager who manages the building in accordance with those risk assessments. And that is why the severe penalties, the really nasty stuff in the Building Safety Bill, is reserved for the accountable person. So I know lots of organizations are running around at the moment trying to find building safety managers, and everyone's setting up frameworks to appoint them. And we don't quite know what the qualifications are going to be yet, but we will hopefully very shortly. But actually, the real focus, and my top tip for you today, is not necessarily to get sidetracked by thinking too much about the building safety manager. That is obviously important and necessary. But what you should be doing as an organization is working out who within your organization, who are the team of people that are going to discharge the obligations of the accountable person, because it is those obligations that are by far and away the most significant and the most serious. And we have resident engagement, of course. Resident engagement is managed by the building safety manager, but the resident engagement strategy itself has to be set up and is governed by the accountable person. So do I have any more slides, Pasaka, or is that?
No, that's your last
okay,
slide, Mark.
right, fantastic. All right, well, I think I overran by a couple of minutes, so hopefully I've given you the gist of what this is all about.
No, that's absolutely excellent, Mark, and really appreciate that it is very hard in such a short period of time to do justice to this. But I think the top tip that you gave us there at the end is going to be very much appreciated, and this is probably going to be a presentation people will want to rewatch. In fact, by the time it could be that people will be rewatching it when they hear me speaking now. So I'm going to move us on. I think gateways is something we're going to hear a lot more about. It is our focus is really around development, but I think what has also come across already is that fact that we are building buildings that go into management under the same legislation, and that is absolutely key. We have to set up and ensure that we are building safety in right from the start. So let me bring in Dave Rowson. Dave is a fire safety consultant. He's worked for the London Fire Brigade in fire safety and also in local authorities. So brings us a wealth of real practitioner experience. Dave, I'm just looking for you right now on my screen.
I'm here.
Excellent. Right,
Brilliant.
I'm going to pass straight over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Mark. I'm exhausted listening to you. I don't know how you managed to get in a 218-page document on the Building Safety Bill with 147 clauses and 6 parts in 15 minutes. I think your next topic is to do astrophysics in 20 minutes. I was well impressed. Are we on the first slide there? Can we go to the next slide, please, Visika, if that's okay? So before we start, I'm going to try and give a pragmatic and practical view on things. Many of the slides that you will see will cross over with Mark. I won't be going into the detail that Mark so eloquently did. Most of those slides will be there for your information. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to put links to those pieces of information so at your own pace, you can look at that and digest what's come through today. You would have probably attended a lot of seminars and meetings where people have spoken about a lot of things. To some of us, it may be a particularly dry subject, but I just kind of want to say right at the very beginning that there is not one golden bullet that cures all. It's resident-centered, as you know, and nobody that I've met yet is ahead of the curve. So don't think, listening to what I've got to say coming up and what Mark said already, and from all those other meetings that you've been to, that you've got some issues, that you're behind, that you're not going to keep up with things, that everything is disastrous. Everybody is in the same boat as you at the moment. There isn't one out there at the moment I can give you that's well ahead of that curve. So the very first slide, as you can see, that the government has confirmed that this to be the biggest changes to building safety in a generation. I would argue that word generation should have an S on the end. I think it goes back much, much further than that. And Mark, again, very eloquently described to you the content in as best detail as he could in such a short time around the Fire Safety Act and the Building Safety Bill. That a lot of that is remiss of information. There's a lot of secondary legislation coming through. Mark talked about past documents. There are amendments to building regulations to guidance that accompanies those regulations. There's MHCLG advice notes. There's just a whole tranche of information at the moment. It's almost like a tsunami of information, and how you at your level are expected to keep up with it, I'm not quite sure. Can you go on to the next slide, please, Jessica? So that's it. If you can just click through to the second to last one. So we all know where it started. We had a number of fire deaths. We had issues around the stay put advice at that fire. There was refurbishment work going on. The external wall material was combustible. There was a review of the building regulation guidance required. And after the event, they were asked to consider sprinkler retrofit, but it wasn't Grenfell. Next piece, please. And the next one, please. Lakanal House 2009. Those things that were mentioned back in 2009, what are we looking at now, 12 years ago, kind of fit the same pattern of events that happened in Grenfell in 2017. So there is a big argument about some of those things not being reacted to at the time. Can we have that next slide, please, Jessica? There you go. I mean, you've seen that picture 1,000 times. I don't think it ever loses the power to sort of make you think about things in great detail about what happened. Next slide, please, Jessica. So the question is what has this got to do with new build schemes? Because both Grenfell and Lakanal were primarily around the refurbishments of buildings. And I know this is a new development forum, and you could be asking yourself, well, really, is it relevant? Can I have the next slide, please, Jessica? So it's not all bad, is it? But Dame Judith Hackett, who you'll see on the next slide as well, in her report, Building a Safety Future, where there was an interim report and a final report, she stated that building safety is neither sufficiently prioritised during procurement, design and construction. And you will see that she's made some other statements there, which you can come back at and you're probably well aware of and familiar with. Next slide, please, Jessica. And again, there she is. She's a bit of a pin-up of mine now. She's done some brilliant stuff. She's a chemical engineer. And again, there's some other statements there, but the one I put in red is one I think concerns most people. And she's put there will be those that will be fearful that change will slow down the build of much needed housing. However, there is every reason to believe that the opposite will be true. More rigor and oversight at the front end of the process can lead to significant increases in productivity, reduction in ongoing costs, and to better outcomes for all in the latter and ongoing stages of the process. And just to reinforce that, I've now lost count of the amount of new build schemes that I've been to where there have been significant failings resulting in delayed occupation and some pretty extensive costs to remediate. So the urgency to get a scheme completed can sometimes be to the detriment of the build. Can I have the next slide, please, Jessica? So what else can I do? You could ask. You could say, I've had in my schemes previously, I've had some brilliant architects. I've always used some really good engineers, and I've included in that fire engineers. I've used building control and I've met the minimum standards. I've had the fire service involved in the schemes. They've approved the drawings and they've been on site even during construction phase. So I've got years of experience with the people I use and the people in the team. You know, I've applied to CDM. I've got great competent contractors. I've got, you know, I've used the clerk of the works, good employers agents, and we always listen to people. Next one, please, Jessica. So I disagree. I disagree that we need all of this. And there's the timeline for Dame Judith. And can we have the next slide? And you will notice it's a bit of a whistle stop. And I'm sorry for all of this because, like I said, I hope the slide's going to be more informative to you afterwards. There's a short timeline up until 2020, which showed a couple of fires and some MHCLG building advice notes. So for those that disagree, let's go to the next slide, please, Jessica. Okay. There it is, Orwell Building, West Hampstead, July 2017. As Mark mentioned in his presentation, there was a period of time immediately following Grenfell, where we had some, in inverted commas, significant fires, or certainly high profile fires. And this building, and in fact, all the buildings I'm now going to show you, were buildings under 18 metres. So Mark's referred to higher risk buildings, and they are termed high risk buildings. That's the definition under the Building Safety Act. And higher risk buildings are defined as those buildings currently over 18 measured from the highest habitable floor down to the ground. Now, Orwell Building was a joint venture. And my apologies to anyone in this room that may have association with any of these fires. I could have picked out a number of fires, but I've just picked a few out. This was a joint venture by Ballymore and Network Rail. Timber balconies with the frames wrapped in ACM, did have sprinklers, but there was significant damage from smoke spread and from water damage, ironically, from the sprinklers. And this was caused by a discarded cigarette. Now, with all of these fires, in theory, the fire should stay within the compartment. Generally, the compartment in the case of our blocks of flats are the flats themselves, the dwellings. Our common areas are sterile, so unless somebody goes in there with a sofa or a can of petrol and sets light to it, we're talking about the dwelling. So all of these pictures, think about it as this, that it should have stayed within the room of origin or the flat of origin, and shouldn't be spreading up the outside or through the building in a quick amount of time. Could you go to the next slide, please, Jessica? Samuel Garside House, Barking, June 2019. Again, built in 2014. There were 8 flats rebuilt. 12 were, further 12 were affected by water damage or damage to the front doors. So that's thank you to Fire Brigade for smashing down those doors to see if everyone's in there. 27 escape damage, but they were all taken out of the properties, and none of them could return until the work was done. Could you go to the next one, please? Limehouse Lodge, a Taylor Wimpey project. 1 person was rescued. The cladding was Western red cedar, and it was attached to the building with brackets made of thermal wood. But hey, it's been fire treated, so it's okay. But there you go, have a look at that one. It did have galvanized steel framed balconies, but they were a timber decking, and up it went. Can I have the next one, please? Cube Bolton, a really famous one, this one. And the reason it's really famous is it was 16 centimetres short of the 18 metre mark. And so at the time, the interpretation of the building regs, and it's the guidance that accompanies the building regs, the approved document B in this case, the assumption is that if it's under 18 metres, nothing applies. So they built it as they did, and you can see the result of that top floor there in the cube. It was, again, a discarded cigarette, constructed in 2015. Can I have the next one, please? Now, in an awful way, this is one of my favourites, but awful for the individuals there. There is a complex which was a residential retirement complex. It is a building which was constructed, I think, around about 2014. I stand to be corrected on that. Again, let's go back to my commentary about a fire remaining within the compartment. Can I have the next picture, please, Jessica? There you go. Complete destruction. Absolutely did not do as was designed on the tin. So these are not to frighten you. These are to make you aware of what can happen when things go wrong. Now, we have hundreds and hundreds of fires every day. I've had the odd fire here, which we put out quickly. It's when these fires get larger and out of control that we have these catastrophic events. But still, the building should, to some degree, retain that damage, keep that damage to a minimum. It certainly shouldn't be doing this, that's for sure. Can I have the next one, please, Jessica? So, Building Safety Bill, again, Dame Judith Hackett from 2017 is saying, and has always said, act now, act now. So there is an element of panic with us all that she's now been saying this for 4 years, and 4 years later, here we are still talking about it. But let me just go back to what I was saying at the very beginning. There is so much to do, it's overwhelming. And I think, which will be the next bit we'll be coming to, we'll start to put some practical elements to all of this. Next slide, please, Jessica. And there you go. There's our building advice notes, which were combined in January 2020. So there are on the web a number of advice notes. There's been updates to building regulations. There's been updates to the procedural guidance between building control and the fire brigade. There's been amendments to the guidance that accompanies the building regulations. And I've just having listened to Mark, and Mark was talking about the building regulations. I don't know how aware people are. There's a copy, one copy of ADB. It comes in 2 volumes, one for dwelling houses and one for non-dwelling houses. And Mark was talking about the functional requirements within that. In this particular copy, if I open it up, their functional requirements are those that are in a green box. There they are, that piece there. I've got 5 of those, just a few sentences in each book. The rest of it is guidance. And again, I've seen a commentary up there about fire engineering. Fire engineering is allowed. This book gives you guidance, and it's that interpretation of guidance that so confuses people. It's supposedly been made easier for people to understand since Grenfell. I disagree. I don't think it is easier, and we'll kind of come on to some bits and pieces in a minute. Can I have the next slide, please, Visica? Okay, so again, I'm not gonna harp on too much and repeat too much what Mark has said, because this you can look at your own pace. It's there in the slides. Have a look at it when you feel ready to. Can I have the next one, please, Visica? And again, a timeline. And again, it gives you an idea of how things will be going forwards and when they expect to see those things. Again, I'm not going to go through those section by section. And gosh, Mark did a great job in such a short time. I'm certainly not going to give it a go now, but it's there. You can have a look at it when this is finished. Visica, can I have the next one, please? And there's the 3 gateways that Mark spoke about. Now, the interesting one is that Gateway 1 starts on August the 1st. There is a little thing that you can go on to, which tells you about something called a fire statement, which we'll come on to in a moment. But Gateway 1 starts quite soon. And those of you that have worked with the London plan, or what was the draft London plan, may be aware of the complexities around a fire statement and what that involves. Can I have the next one, please, Visica? I did say there was a lot of slides, didn't I? Again, what's the Gateway 1 proposals? You'll see there about kind of elaborate or kind of going on into a bit more detail than Mark did, because Mark didn't have the opportunity to speak about this in the detail that it deserved. Again, look at this in your own time. Can I have the next one, please, Visica? And there's more information on the fire statement. Now, the fire statement has a number of sections, and it varies in terms of the building you have. At the moment, they're asking for fire statements on, I believe, on buildings over 18 metres or higher, which is the high risk buildings, I believe. I stand to be corrected, but I think that's the case. And in that, there are a number of sections that you've got to fill in. I have done them for London plans. I haven't done one yet for this. Like I say, it starts on August the 1st, so it's going to be an interesting exercise for us all going forward. Now, the next one, please, Visica. And again, Gateway 2, and you're going to have several of these slides where it gives you a box by box thing, which look through at your own pace. Next one, please, Visica. And Gateway 3 again, and we can move on to the next one. So there's a link in that I've given you to the REBA stages for you guys when you're going through your design and your concepts, your construction. Those are the REBA stages that we work to. So you'll see it's from 0 to 7. If you go onto that link, it will tell you where you should interact with fire safety professionals. You may be very fortunate enough to have fire safety professionals in your organisation. You may need to employ fire safety professionals from elsewhere. But if you go onto that link, those REBA stages will tell you what's required at what stage. Now, one thing that I have put in here's my presentation, look, there's my notes, that's it. But one thing I've put on there is that the thing that surprised me the most in all of this, bearing in mind that I've worked with this before Lakanal and since Lakanal and before Grenfell and since Grenfell is with all due respect to everybody, I've never seen so many experts coming out the woodwork, who I never saw before Grenfell, and now I'm awash with them. So I'm really pleased that we've now got all of these experts giving us all this great advice. I just wish they were there before Grenfell, and I'm glad they're there now. Can I have the next slide, please, Visica? So what else? Okay, so we said we spoke about the practical elements. So procurement's a big one. The procurement of contractors, of the work you're doing, whatever it is, procurement is under the magnifying glass at the moment. It's part of the competency framework. Within that competency framework, they're asking for a lead procurement officer, and that lead procurement officer should have a certain amount of fire safety knowledge in order to oversee the appropriate procurement of any fire safety services. Competencies. Again, third party is not a legal requirement at the moment. It's the preferred standard because you can audit somebody from the very beginning of the process to the very end. But even so, third party accreditation may be that I have one person that's registered under third party accreditation scheme and they're overseeing 20 people. I've been to many a project which has been worked on by third party accredited companies that have been disastrous. So it's about the competencies of the people you employ, whether as contractors, whether you have subcontractors coming in, or whether you use your own staff, your own in-house staff have those required competencies. So those are the things you've got to start thinking about going forward. Building relationships with your contractors. I mean, I just gave contractors a really bad name there by saying I've seen some awful contractors, but by the same token, there's some excellent contractors. And I wonder if the key to all of this is not to look at it as getting the lowest price and something done in the quickest time. I wonder if there's an alternative to that in building those relationships with your contractors going forward, because the key to getting good work done is definitely not getting it done at the cheapest rate and in the quickest amount of time. That is a recipe for disaster. That just generates poor buildings. So I wonder if we need to have a look at how we build those relationships and whether they're longer term relationships with our contractors. Checks and balances is, okay, once we've procured our people, we've got the right people, what are the checks and balances? How are we checking they're doing that work right? Are we, for example, do we know that the doors that are being installed that we've got primary test evidence for, that have been installed by a third party accredited company, do we know they're installing them correctly? The same with fire stopping, etc. Future proofing, golden thread, those most vulnerable. So future proofing is I've put in there because I know that your design and development can sometimes take years. These standards and everything that's going on can just take over. So what you designed 3-4 years ago and are now building may have been surpassed by those standards. So it's about thinking in your employer's requirements what you want for your buildings going forward. So think ahead to 5 years time. Think about is it what we have are required by legislation to have in our buildings over 18 meters? Are we going to require that in our buildings going forward in all buildings? The draft, sorry, I keep saying the draft, the London plan talks about having evacuation lifts and talks about sprinklers in lower rise buildings. And just think about what is it that you want to do in your buildings going forward, because what you don't want to be doing is going back to them in 3-4 years time as a result of what a risk assessor said. The golden thread information, which is really important, and I think you'll come onto this bit later, is about the collation of all of that information through the design and the construction phase and the handover at the handover phase. That's a really important thing. Think about those that are most vulnerable in our society. There's at the moment a consultation about following a legal challenge by residents from Grenfell, where one disabled person died, is that we don't consider disabled residents in general needs properties enough. Now, quite often we'll look at the approved document M, and I'll quite often get M4 quoted at me where it says I can put disabled residents on in any floor. What we've got to think about is how do they get out? We also have got in there, where do we put our things like mobility scooters and electric wheelchairs, mobility aids, all of those things that need charging. Quite often we stick those right in the entrance hall of their flats, and boy, do they burn. You're never going to get out of that flat. But we say it's in the regs, it's in the guidance, it's allowed. Show me where it's not allowed. But just think about that. And also think about your costs going forward. There potentially could be some increased costs. I think the long term, there could be savings, but think about those long-term costs going forward. Is it going to cost you more per unit, per building going ahead? And that will have an effect on your program. Can I have the next slide, please, Jessica? And I don't know how we're doing on time. I'm trying to rattle through this now. So again, these are things that Mark spoke about. It's there for your perusal. Can I have the next one, please, Jessica? Yeah, best thing I could think of to remind you of ERs, George Clooney. I was going to put a picture of me, but I thought it wouldn't do it justice, so you've got George instead. So the big thing to think about with your ERs is to think about your building strategy. The thing that people never think about when they start building their buildings is who's going to be living in there and what is the fire strategy. And 9 times out of 10, I get to a building and the first thing I ask is what is the strategy and why isn't the building designed to that strategy? So the first thing is the strategy. What is the building's fire strategy? The next thing is what standard are you building it to? The next thing, are you going to consider automatic water fire suppression systems like sprinklers or water mist systems? Preferably sprinklers at the moment, because water mist is a relatively new technology and it derives from the maritime industry. Think about whether you want wayfinding in, and I've got wayfinding and third party on the same line. The third party accreditation should have been the next line. Think about only using third party accreditation. Think about your lifts, because I say there's a requirement, there is a recommendation for evacuation lifts, which I don't necessarily agree with, and I can talk about in great detail later, but think about your lifts. Think about your evacuation systems. They're asking for BS 8629 emergency evacuation panels and alarm systems for high-rise buildings. Do you build that into there? Like I said, think about your disabled people and think about secondary power supplies for your life support systems. Think about all of those things going forward. There's a lot to think about. Vishika, the next slide, please. Think about it again. One system for all buildings. Don't apply a 2-tier system. This is what Dame Judith Hackett says. She says, whatever you apply to one, apply to the other. Think about that seriously. Power supplies we talked about. PVs and inverters. Think about where those inverters are. We have an awful lot of issues around PVs and inverters. Think about, for example, we put those inverters and linking up detection to those. They have a habit of catching fire, those inverters. Smoke ventilation systems. The fire we had at Providence Wharf recently talked about the lack of maintenance on the ventilation systems. But again, I've gone into buildings where the ventilation systems are not suitable and sufficient, and when they've been tested or commissioned, didn't work as they should have done. Think about the secure by design arrangements. Really important to our residents. Follow the secure by design arrangements. Don't do it so the fire brigade can't get in. Do it to that guidance. Think about green roofs. Think about what you should be doing there and roof systems, because we think about the external fire spread on walls, but we forget about the roofs. And sometimes there is a requirement for roofs and fire spread. Think about primary test evidence for all the stuff you got. Think about resident engagement. Remember, the building safety bill is resident centered. Think about our residents at the middle of all of this where we can. The regulation 38 and fire safety information, really important. Make sure you get all of that. And that bit at the bottom, you know, for you guys who are much cleverer than I, the cash flow contractors, and about any delay because of all of these things, what the impact that will have on those people. Can I have the next one, please, Vishika? There you go, there's a timeline. And again, just to back up what Mark said and to build a little bit upon what I said, there is the government timeline on the introduction of those things coming through in terms of the legalities of things. Next one, please, Vishika. And there you go. I think, is that my last slide? Again, what I've done there, it's again for your use. Some of those documents that I've referred to or haven't referred to that I should refer to, but haven't had the time to refer to them, are there. Just, you know, copy and paste, put them into your search engine and have a look at them at your leisure. Don't be overwhelmed. Don't be overwhelmed, but there is a lot of information there, but don't be overwhelmed. Like I say, everyone's in the same boat and together we'll get there. Thank you, Vishika.
Thanks very much, Dave. You've packed a lot into that presentation. There's a lot of material within it, so we will be circulating that. For our YouTube audience, if you want to contact Future of London, do so. We'll be able to send that out to you as well. Okay, well, Mark, you are a partner at BPTW and you lead on design technology. We've had a couple of references already today around the use of BIM. BIM is going to be, I think it was Mark, maybe it was Dave, who said how essential that would be, particularly to the development of tall buildings. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's good to be here today. I'm responsible for BIM services at BPTW, and I'm involved in industry bodies that relate to BIM, like BIM for Housing Association and the Golden Thread Initiative. My focus today is on BIM and how it relates to the Building Safety Bill. Just a thank you as well to Mark and David for their excellent presentations, and as we just touched on, hopefully that sets us up to talk about BIM. So next slide, please. And the next slide. And the next slide. So firstly, I'd like to give you a quick overview to show the building safety timeline against the BIM timeline. So UK construction industry first became fully aware of BIM in 2009 when the government appointed Paul Morrell as their BIM advisor. He implemented pilot projects and delivered such successful results that the government set a mandate that all publicly funded projects had to be undertaken in accordance with what was then BIM Level 2 by April 2016. The mandate came and went with little real impact on the housing sector because it didn't directly apply, so uptake was quite slow, to say the least. Everything was brought back into focus by the appalling Grenfell tragedy, of course, in 2017. Dame Judith Hackett then delivered her Building a Safe Future report in 2018, which recommended wholesale reform, the procurement, design, delivery and management of high-rise residential buildings. Hackett report in 2018 recommended the use of BIM in order to deliver critical information and the appointment of accountable individuals to take responsibility for the safety at each stage of a project. The report made 53 recommendations, and these were adopted by the government, published the draft Building Safety Bill in 2020. 2 weeks ago, the Building Safety Bill went to the House of Commons. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the Hackett report had 53 recommendations, and some of the key areas included those highlighted in this slide. So I won't labour on these too much because it's been touched on in the previous presentation, but these were the Building Safety Regulator and Housing Ombudsman, the Golden Thread, gateways, duty holders, accountable person and building safety manager, building safety cases, residents first, and construction products. Now, obviously, the bill will have a huge impact on the way we work with major financial implications, but there will be financial implications to clients, of course, but there are also major implications to everyone else involved on a project. We will need to change our culture and the way we work to ensure that we can deliver in accordance with legislation, which could come as early as 23. So for the people who think we have time, there really isn't any. Next slide, please. So what is BIM and where does it fit in? So BIM is information management. At the heart of every BIM project is information, from cost information, construction sequencing to sustainable design. BIM provides a method of collaborating and communicating effectively to manage digital information at every project stage. BIM is information modeling, a way of collaborating and communicating effectively to enable the management of that digital information at every stage of a project. At the heart of every BIM project is a 3D model, which is key information embedded within that model. Decision as to what information is to be embedded and then provided at each stage of the scheme is made by the client and the project team at the earliest possible stage, and is primarily geared towards delivering the information required by the building owner to manage and maintain the building safely and in the future. To provide clear BIM deliverables, it's therefore really important that EIRs are created. Now I'm getting into BIM terminology here, so bear with me, I'll try and be as clear as possible. EIRs are exchange information requirements and AIRs are asset information requirements. They're very specific BIM deliverables, and these should be produced by the client. These requirements clearly state what information the client needs, in what format, and at what stage of the project. A BIM project cannot be undertaken, only be undertaken successfully when the end user, the building owner, has produced these documents. Regrettably, it's often the case, we're still asked to just deliver BIM. So at tender and feasibility stage, as architects especially, that's basically what our clients say. So they really need to have thought through their information requirements at a very early stage. BIM relates to the golden thread, which, as I've mentioned, is a core part of the Building Safety Bill. Next slide, please. So this is the MHCLG's definition of the golden thread, which was recently released. The golden thread is both the information that allows you to understand the building and the steps needed to keep both the building and people safe now and in the future. So the golden thread is therefore the right information at the right format to the right people at the right time. A lot of rights there. Or alternatively, the information needed to understand the building and to enable the owner to maintain the safety of the residents, which is a very clear part of the bill. The Building Safety Bill states that the golden thread must be delivered on all future high-rise residential buildings, as we've covered in the previous presentations. It does not say BIM has to be used in order to deliver it. So it's quite important, because I've had quite a lot of people sort of say, is BIM really needed and is it in the bill? It isn't. So whilst there are other digital approaches you could take to deliver the golden thread, BIM is a tried and tested approach which is likely to find favour with the Building Safety Regulator. If BIM is used correctly, is therefore the best way to deliver the golden thread of information. Next slide, please. So BIM can help deliver the golden thread as a tried and tested process backed up by an international standard that delivers structured digital information. But there are many other reasons BIM should be considered as a digital information delivery process. There will be future digital standards being released, as the MHCLG statement on the screen now suggests, an example of which is the recent draft BS 8644. Next slide, please. Documents like the BS 8644 Part 1, which is the digital management of fire safety information, focuses on design, construction, handover, asset management, and emergency response. It's currently available in draft for comment, so it's not released yet. This is specifically intended to be read with the BIM ISO to provide a common industry approach to the management of digital building information specifically related to fire information. The BS gives recommendations for the management, presentation, and exchange of fire safety information using digital information management process. The standard introduces FIRE, as it's called, which is an information exchange for fire safety information. Now, this is being proposed to bridge the COBE standard, which is a BIM standard deliverable, because that lacks the emphasis on fire safety. So FIRE, as it's called, is an information exchange framework proposed for exchanging predetermined and evolving fire safety information. It sets out the information needed, with actions attributed to nominated persons throughout the life cycle of the built asset, as well as template fire safety properties for inclusion within the BIM model. So it's very, very closely linked to the BIM side of things. COBE is asset data, which is held within the BIM model also. So COBE is a set of instructions on the format of the information that is to be held in the BIM model. The client should issue an information delivery plan and requirements that will tell the appointed party, so the architects and the rest of the design team, the information that they need to provide to them. Next slide, please. So David has touched on this in the previous presentation also, but in addition to the golden thread, the government have introduced 3 new gateways, which the diagram shows. Gateway 1 requirements have been published, and at each of these gateways, the duty holders, which I'll mention shortly, have a requirement to submit certain information to demonstrate that they've considered the safety of the building throughout the design, construction, and operation of the building. For Gateway 1, applicants need to demonstrate that the plan and application incorporates thinking on fire safety, where it relates to land planning use. Specialist fire safety expertise is to be provided to local planning authorities on a statutory basis. And as we've touched on already, this begins in August this year. Now, it's important to note the BIM is not a requirement of the legislation, as I mentioned earlier. However, it makes sense to use an existing standard and framework for the delivery of the legislation rather than making up a new one. And in most people's eyes, it is agreed the use of the UK BIM framework and the BIM, which is part of the BIM ISO standard, is seen as best practice to achieve this. So deliver the information that allows you to understand the building, e.g. the golden thread, of course. Each of the gateways, at some point, you need to find what that information is. Instead of creating a new document or a new way of doing this, it already exists within the UK BIM framework. These are the asset information requirements, which are issued to the supply chain at the beginning of a project, along with the other BIM deliverable documents, which are EIRs, OIRs, and PIRs, more acronyms for you, which everybody loves in the BIM world. So in addition, within the UK BIM framework is the level of information need and COBE, which I touched on already. These standards help to define the granularity of information to be delivered, as well as giving a structured method of exchanging set information requirements. Finally, as mentioned in the previous slide, the information needs to be structured digital information that is stored, managed, and maintained in line with the digital standards. Again, with the BIM standards, there's an existing process already in place for the management of that information called CDE, Common Data Environment. And whilst the CDE is a process in itself, which all of BIM is often be aligned with a digital system. So the CDE there's many software manufacturers out there like A-Site, Dalux, 360, to name a few, that deliver on that. Next slide, please. So the Building Safety Bill introduced new responsibilities, as we touched on, in the form of duty holders, the accountable person, the building safety manager. So the key duty holders are listed here. The roles will need to coordinate their work to ensure that it complies with legislation, including the delivery of the golden thread and gateway requirements. Fundamental reason for the UK BIM framework is to set out this process for successful information management, which includes the coordination of information. Some of the key ISO items include the CDE, which I've mentioned, as well as the use of responsibility matrices, information delivery tables to plan out the process. Moreover, the ISO 19650 introduces the information management function. This function sets out how information can be managed and controlled throughout the life cycle of a project, and the information management activities can be performed by these duty holders to allow them to comply with the Building Safety Bill. Next slide, please. Finally, after a building has been designed, constructed, and passed through Gateway 3, the accountable person must maintain a live building safety case for the building, demonstrating that risks are continuously reviewed and managed to ensure the safety of the residents. Fundamentally, this part of the legislation is the building safety case, which cannot be created if it is not built on a robust set of information, the golden thread, which BIM provides. Furthermore, keeping the building safety case live is not to be underestimated. This will be a big task, and some considered approaches may need to be update the building safety case based on trigger events. When you review the ISO 19650 Part 3, which is the ISO standards are in a number of parts, this one specifically sets how our triggered events can cause new and updated information to be produced and managed. These triggered events can be scheduled through planned maintenance, whilst others could be unexpected. The BIM ISO sets out different pathways dependent on each type of these trigger events. So by using the standard, again, to plan your triggered events or your response to unexpected trigger events, you will be able to maintain your building safety. Next slide, please. So, in conclusion, Building Safety Bill brings significant changes to every aspect of delivery and management of high-rise residential buildings. It requires that digital information be used and developed, and that all organisations involved in these processes commit accordingly. Building owners and appointing parties should look to implement BIM and engage with information managers, which is a specific role which is mentioned within the BIM standards. develop their own digital information requirements for future and existing projects, because they need to be able to receive and use the digital information for new and existing stock. The client needs to specify what information they need in order to manage their assets safely, in what format they require it, and at which stage or gateway of the project. Under the BIM standards, this is known as the Exchange Information Requirements and the Asset Information Requirements. So in order to develop these two key documents, it's likely they will need to work with an information manager who is fully conversant with digital technology and who can assist with the asset team, development teams, and IT teams to interrogate working practices and identify the information needs of the organization. BIM for HA, which I mentioned earlier that BPW are a part of, have just produced a toolkit which forms a suite of template BIM standards that can help to produce these BIM requirements. But they are very much templates, so BIM expertise will still be required to incorporate these into a specific organization. So clients and appointing parties need to be clear on information requirements at invitation to tender or pre-appointment stage. And again, we see it all the time that that is not the case. It is always something that is picked up later on. It needs to be done very early on and before people are appointed and the design team are appointed. Otherwise, a lot of confusion is caused. And the BIM and the ISO 19650 and the UK BIM framework is not going to be a requirement of the Building Safety Bill, but it is a tried and tested structured approach to digital management of information throughout the life cycle of a building, so can deliver the golden thread. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.